Welcome back. This is a Q&A session, and as usual, it's crazy how this works with us. That I don't know how it happens, but we get the same questions, and they can be just so random, come out of nowhere. And Ken, this is Ken from Asheville, he wrote one today, and I just happened to notice it. And believe it or not, I think we got 3 this week that are kind of the same question. And so Ken says he's I'm going to kind of paraphrase this. I guess I'm a little late to this, but I was wondering about beginning fly time. So I've been fishing all my life, made bass lures, etc., but now I want to start fly time. I have no idea where to even start. I've watched all your videos, and I can find, including which vise to buy video, and they are very informative. My question is probably too vague for a simple answer, but I was wondering where to start with fly tying. I want to make my own streamers, trout, bass, etc. I also want to do nymphs. I do a lot of nymph fishing. I want to be able to tie my own pheasant tails and hares. I don't know what tools, materials I would need to accomplish this. Could you recommend some tools, thread sizes, brands, etc.? I know I can learn from watching videos, but there isn't much information out there on how to find which tools. This is really important. Which tools to buy first. Differences in materials and things of that nature. I'd rather spend a little bit more up front and not have to buy more down the line. Unfortunately, that part of it can't be fixed. It's a great question, Ken. And so I'm going to go, and we have tutorials on vises and stuff like that too. And so I'm going to go through kind of what Ken was asking about the tools to buy first. And as Ken said, he would like to buy a little more up front and then not have to buy them twice. And what I was saying about it's kind of impossible to do that because a little of it you have to get used to what you like the feel of. And the cool thing about fly tying is that there's just tons of gadgets. And so, I love to work with wood. I buy tools constantly. And the bottom line is generally speaking, the tools are better than me. And so it takes a while for me to get to their level. And so you can't go buy, and we talked about that on the vise thing when we did our vise tutorial, that, they kind of all do the same thing. They hold the hook, but there's things they do, once you've developed into it better than the other ones, and they have different things. But that's not really what he's asking about. He's asking about which tools to get started. And it's a really relative question because we talk a lot about kits and things like that when we're in the past when we've talked about beginning fly tying. And kits are okay, but they generally, they're not, and I'm going to go over what he asked about the different materials to buy in a second, but they don't generally give you a really good vise. They don't generally give you really good anything. They're just trying to get you started economically. And so just as a beginning point, the first thing we're going to have to do, and again, I have a tutorial on vises. I pulled my vise. I tie in a Renzetti. That's a super high-end vise. Hell, it's probably still better than I am. So, but I'm not going to talk about vises really, but they basically go in. You start, most of us that have been tying for a long time started with a Thompson A or that style of vise. And they're just a cam lever vise that holds the hook. And they start anywhere, again, you can start with a $60, $80 vise and it'll be good for a long time. It'll do a lot of stuff. And they'll do, basically you could go forever on one. And so, but before I do, and I talked about this in my tutorial thing, they're all the same. These things all are on a cam. They're not all the same. They all do the same function, but basically they do the same thing. But most of your less expensive vise are on cams right here. This is a cam. This lever is, and it pulls this vise jaw down. When you tighten that, it tightens it up here, and it holds your hook. That's all there is to it. And so, and the one thing, and I think I touched on this on my vise thing, when you get your vise, learn to adjust this. It's not one size fits all. You've got to learn to adjust this so different hooks. I'm not going into that, but just as a sidebar. And so basically vices come, when you watch my stuff, I'm on a fixed vise. I'm just, I just like it better. I'm not a big fan of pedestals because they put me up a little high, and I like to tie a little bit lower down. Here's focal point. You'll get used to that. So basically, your vices come with a C-clamp or they come with a pedestal. Way more mobile to, tie anywhere. This, you got to have a table or something you can affix this to. That's enough about vices, because that's not really what Ken was asking. So, and again, we have those things. So as far as tools go, and this is a great question. I don't know if I've ever touched on it at all. We've done different ones on different tools, but never about just getting started. And so I'm going to give you the 5-cent tour of the tools I think you really should have that are kind of necessities for what we're going to do. And so if we're going to the vise, the first thing you've got to have is, I guess, would be, and please don't anybody write in and tell me that you don't use this and you don't do that. This is just generalities. I don't care if you use vice grips for your hook. This is kind of a generality. Everybody writes in and says, I don't use that. I don't use it. Good for you. This is kind of a general how to get started thing. So the first thing I'd say you have to have is you're going to have something that holds the thread. And you see these things over here. The bobbins are just, you're going to have, I've got all these different kinds. It's just, this is a luxury. You do not need that. You don't need 10 of these. You need one to get started. These things are relatively inexpensive. They'll go anywhere from, you see the really cheap ones for like $6, $7. If you go into these ceramic bobbins, and I would just suggest you start with a mid-range bobbin, there are vices on that thing that I have had since the 80s, and they're still going strong. You buy one of these $15 to $20 bobbins, you will have it for a long time. And then you're going to learn how to apply that pressure. That's all learning to use the tool. But as a basic start point, you're going to start with, you're going to start with just some sort of, mid-range bobbin, and the rest of that's going to you're going to learn it holds your thread. So segueing from the bobbin that's going to hold your thread, he said about materials. And so threads, with the popularity, fly tying is growing in popularity in leaps and bounds. And so with threads, and I've got two different styles here, and so, or not two different thicknesses. I've got 3/0 and 6/0. And so you'll see, I would not suggest that you start with a real fine diameter thread like 6/0. I would start with just a basic 3/0 thread. The 3/0 thread, and get it in black and white. And I've said this in other videos, that I would really encourage people when they first start to use white thread so you can see it on your hook, and not necessarily tie. Just learn, and I'm gonna show at the very end how to start your thread, because I've actually got quite a few questions on that online. But basically what you want to learn is how to hold the tension. Look, I got Johnny's bobbin again, that's his pink thread. And so you're going to learn to hold the tension. You're going to learn what's comfortable in your hand. There's all these different styles. It comes down to this. It's what's comfortable in your hand, and you'll learn to put the right amount of tension on your thread. And so if you start with a basic 3/0 thread in 2 colors, you're pretty golden. It's a little thicker, and that's learning your tools, right? We have thread now down to, this is 6/0, the finer of the two. We have 18/0 thread now that's virtually impossible to break. Things have progressed so far. That's one of the cool things about how popular this is getting. But I still would like people to start with 3/0 thread, because you'll learn tension, you'll learn how much, aside from the thread breaking, you're trying to learn how much tension it takes to secure your material without cutting it in half. Too much tension can cut it, compromise it. Too loose and your materials are loose and the fly falls apart. If you learn with 3/0 and you just learn to do really nice clean tension, it's a great starting point. And again, this isn't about anything other than just basic getting started, nothing else. You're going down to the fly shop and you want to buy what you need. So you're going to need a bobbin, you're going to need thread. Next thing you're going to need is scissors. And this is, and I can tell you, I was thinking about this when I was sitting here thinking about how to do this. I tied, and I remember they used to call them baby fingernail scissors, because everybody used to cut their fingernails with these little scissors. I tied with the same set of scissors, probably would be $2 equivalent to today, until I was in my teen. I started tying when I was 5 years old. I tied with the same scissors forever. They're a little bit of a luxury you can buy, and if you see, I tie with Fiskars a lot. I mean, I like these scissors. But if you were to buy, they come from anywhere from $6 to $20, right? Fiskars, $15, something like that. But this is kind of it's an absolute necessity. But the scissor that you buy is completely up to you. It's how these sit in your hand. If you look over here, I've got tons of different scissors, and I have they're for different applications, some of them. But most of this is how they sit in my hand. And I tend to shoot my mouth off a lot and I talk, and even if you're not watching these and I'm sitting here tying, there's always somebody here, and I hardly ever take them out of my hands. And the reason I gravitated the Fiskars is the length of that. I hardly ever stab myself. That's why I did it. They're really clean blades, but they also fit my hand just right. And so when you go in and buy a pair of scissors, and again, when you first start, you're going to set them down, you're going to pick them up. You're going to set them down. So that whole thing that I just said about how I hold them in my hand isn't really relative. But you're eventually going to have to find one that you like the feel of. For years, I tied on this scissor right here. This is the fine point. I tied on a little bit longer one. And I just liked the way it fit in my hand. It was a good scissor to fit in my hand. Some of them, have these ergonomic holes to hold in your hand so you can move up and down. You may or may not like it. You have to take this out of the bag, just sit there and decide, that's what I like to do. That feels good in my hand. That's all there is to it. I mean, you could probably find a pair of these things in your bathroom vanity and say, oh, those are great and work forever. But it's a necessity. You have to cut your thread and your materials. It's nice to have a good sharp blade. A lot of those things, when you get in and you tie them in and you have to cut them off afterwards, you need to be able to get down there and just cut it nice and clean. So you don't want a pair of scissors that you're hacking away because you'll fray materials, but you'll get used to that. But again, anywhere from $10 to $20, you are going to get a long-term scissor. This thing's going to last you for years, so it's just basic. So far we've got 3 things you really need. The next thing you're going to go to is there's what's called a hackle plier. And so if you're going to tie, and there's just so many types of these things. I love this tweezy. I tied on this one right here. This thing right here, I tied on that. This one I tied on for years. They're just different tools that do the same thing. And again, like Ken asked, I'd rather spend a little bit more up front. And I can tell you, if you go to a tying seminar, you could have 10 different tires there, and they'll all have a different tool. It's what you like the feel of. And so I would say, just from a very basic standpoint, any one of these will hold the feather. These are to hold the feather when you wrap it. And I started with this style right here. I had one of these forever. Now they've got little rubber tips on them, so they hold the feather a little better without breaking it. What you're going to do is you're going to find the one you like. This little tweezy thing, you hold the feather right here. Well, that just happens to sit in my finger pretty easy because I use this rotary vise, where this is the vise I use, where instead of turning it around manually like that, I just hold my feather and the vise does that for me. That sets so easy in my hand, it works. When I first saw this thing, I thought it was junk. I thought, wow, that thing will never work. I love that thing. It's one of my favorite ones ever. And so, but the point is that there's literally dozens of different styles. And so, but they're not expensive. You don't have to spend a fortune, and you can get one. So you buy one that you go in, ask somebody, see which one they like, try it. It's $5-10. You can move on. So, but that's probably you pretty much have to have one. You can hold it with your finger for a while. You can go around and do that. This is kind of a necessity. The next thing that you'll see a lot of, I've got them over here. These are called bodkins. And so what this is, it's a needle. That's all it is. And it's a needle, as you can see here. My buddy Dave made this thing for me. This is a really fancy one. Here's this little tiny one that's just on a wood stick. It is a needle on the end of a piece of wood. That's all it is. You could make your own. But bodkins you end up using these a lot. You'll end up using them to put glue in spots. You'll end up using them to pick things out, just to loosen them up so you can get in there. A lot of these, and this isn't necessarily a necessity, although I use these a lot, but this is a dubbing tool, which isn't something I would start with right out of the gate, but it's got a bodkin on one end. Some of them have a bodkin and a half-hitch tool. Not a necessity, but something you end up using. And the last thing that is probably a necessity nowadays is called a whip finisher. Again, anywhere from $5 to $35, I guess you could spend on these things. This is how you finish your fly. Most classes, most people you see are going to use one of these. These are really cheap. Learn to use one of these. It pretty much is a necessity nowadays because virtually everybody uses one. So if you take a class or watch somebody on video, I don't use one because I didn't have them when I started. And so I learned to do my own, but virtually every tire I know has one of these. So collectively, you take all of this stuff, you're going to end up with less than $40 invested in if you get really pretty good tools, right? And so you're going to have to go through them. So back to the bait, just how I went. I talk too much, I know. So we're going to need a bobbin. You're going to need scissors. You're going to need hackle pliers. You're going to need a whip finisher. Those are things that you really probably should start with. And if you can, find some, go to a fly shop and actually hold them in your hand and see if you like it. You'll adapt to virtually anything. And so the last thing that I didn't really mention, because we talked about materials, and I'll hit on that in a second, but you have two types, this is called head cement, right? These happen to be two different styles. One's an acrylic and one, you can get water-based, you can get acrylic, and you can get lacquers. And if you're an adult and you don't huff this stuff, I don't ever start kids on lacquers. They're just dangerous. You're huffing them a lot, and I wouldn't suggest that. I would suggest you go with water bases, but they're just less odor, especially if you're not. I'm in a giant building, so I'm not really over it that much, but you're going to need that when you start, especially to finish your flies. And so acrylic is the most common one. Acrylics are water-based ones. Either ones are good. You can thin those out with the water bases. Obviously, you'd use water, but for the most part, that's kind of a necessity too. So on the materials thing, that was the last part of his question, and the materials, there is no way for you to do that. There's no way to just say, I'm going to buy, materials for all these flies. What I tell everybody to do, I'm not a big fan of kits. There's a couple of them out there that are pretty dang good, but they're pretty expensive too. And I tell people, I would suggest you pick a fly. Like what Ken said he wanted to tie. He said pheasant tail. He said streamers for both trout and bass. Well, they're kind of the same thing, so it wouldn't matter. But you probably wouldn't start with that. But he said pheasant tails and hare's ears. That's a perfect example. You buy the materials you need for one fly. So if Ken was to go out and buy his materials for pheasant tail, he would have the pheasant tail, he would have wire, he would have thread, probably peacock herl, and that's all it takes for that fly. He also said hare's ears. Well, he could use the pheasant tail for the tail of the hare's ear. He'd have to buy a mask now for the hare's mask to tie the hare's ear. But he's got the peacock. He can use that for the wing case. He can use it for the legs. He has two flies now, same hooks. And so he just built two flies. He started with one, had to add one material to do the second one. And what that does for you when you do it that way is that you don't have all this superfluous crap that you're never going to use. When you buy kits, you generally get things for all kinds of, they're trying to get you stuff so you can do a bunch of flies. Lots of times you don't need it. But wrong size for the fly you're going to tie or something like that. So for me personally, what I suggest people do is say, I want to tie a pheasant tail in a 14 and a 16 or whatever. And you buy the hook for that, right? You buy the hook, you buy the materials and the thread. You go back, you practice that fly. Then you go and you buy the next fly and say, okay, I'm going to do a hare's there. Buy 1 or 2 additional things. As you go, by the time you get a half a dozen flies, you'll be amazed how many crossovers there are. So the tail works for this one, also works for this one. The body works for this one, and then you decide I want to do a woolly bugger, and you go, okay, now I got materials for 2 or 3 other flies. You're going to tie a woolly bugger, well, you can also tie a patch rubber leg with the same materials. And so they start crossing, and you don't have a lot of junk that you don't need. Half the stuff, I have bins and bins of materials. I mean, I've been doing this since I was a child, right? And so it all came the same way, though. I bought materials for 1 fly and just kept building on it. So if you do that, you don't waste a lot of money, and you get materials that are good. And that's one of the things Ken asked. I'd rather spend a little bit up front. And so buying what you need is a way to do that. So it's not that complicated. It's going to be 3 or 4 tools and a good starter vise, and you're basically in. And then build a relationship with your fly shop. Get somebody that can walk you through that. And I really suggest, if you can, to take classes. They're really good, man. There's every place I've ever been in the United States and Canada, there's fly shops that have, and they're really fun. You build a good relationship, and you'll get good technique built when you do that. So that's the basics. I hope you liked it. I hope it helped you out.